Okay, I think we're ready to begin the next session, and then after this we'll be having a discussion with the different scholars. So the next presenter is Stanford Kwinter, who we are very excited about, has now joined the faculty here at the undergraduate and graduate school at Pratt in the School of Architecture. Stanford is a writer and architectural theorist who's previously served as professor of theory and criticism at Harvard's GSD. He's also lectured at the Berlage Institute in Rotterdam, the AA in London, the Stage School in Frankfurt, among others. Co-founder of the influential Zone Books, his publications over the last 20 years have pioneered new ideas in art, architecture, science, and the humanities. He's written widely on philosophical issues related to design, architecture, and urbanism, and was obviously a key player in the any series of conferences and publications. Thank you.
Are these both live? Yeah. No slides, just a lot of words coming. Now, truthfully, I'm very happy to be here. And to tell you the honest truth, I never expected that I would be. My idea was actually to send a letter because the concerns that are being addressed in this conference are ones that, in a way, peripherally at the very least, have been concerns or at least interests of mine for a long, long time. And something clearly in the last 5 to 10 years has begun to shift, and there is truly a kind of a surge of increasingly, shall we say, disciplined interest in these topics. And today's conference obviously is an excellent example of how that's becoming increasingly institutionalized and recognized. And therein lies, I think, the target of what it is that I had thought that I wished to address the conference about. Now, only very recently it become clear that I was actually going to make it. I started to write a letter and then realized that I had all these things that I really wanted to say, and there was some real sort of material that could be included. I didn't get it properly altogether included. And so what I have here, I haven't even read it. This is the first time I'm reading it as I begin to present it to you. And I'll try to bring out what I can in aside comments, some of the ways in which what I think of today in terms of this presentation is essentially as a series of provocations. Now, I was aware of the fact also that ANFA, I've never really participated in one of these conferences or never actually even been at one, but the particular approach of ANFA is one that I'm aware of, and I knew that the proceedings were going to be I don't know if the word is broadcast, but at least made available in real time to a variety of people who aren't actually going to be here. And I thought that one of the roles of a theorist in a certain kind of way would be to expand as much as possible the understanding of how the questions that are being dealt with here are actually being developed in a whole series of other places. So it's a curious privilege, without a doubt, for us in the design disciplines to date little noticed or remarked that neuroscientists and not only architects are now committing time, focus, and resources to better understanding the relationship of the human nervous system to buildings and the built environment. ANFA is a significant player in this effort, as are programs around Semir Zeki's Institute of Neuroaesthetics, conferences and publications efforts originating from the Delft School of Design over the last years, led, among others, by Deborah Hauptmann, who I'm wondering, is she here yet? Oh, yeah, okay, good. I look forward to meeting her. And by and through organizations like artbrain.org, manned and run largely by the efforts of Warren Nidek, an artist but former ophthalmic surgeon and in some ways student of neurobiology, and the Psychopathologies of Cognitive Capitalism group in Berlin, Italy, and Los Angeles. In addition, there is a deep history, they know as the Deep History Group, or the Psychotropy Group at Harvard and at the University of Michigan, not unrelated in many ways to some in the evolutionary psychology group, but largely unknown even to the groups previously mentioned. The evolutionary psychology group are those, in a way, whose association was more or less memorialized 10, 15 years ago in a fairly important publication called The Adapted Mind. But there's an incredibly wide spectrum of positions even among those, though I really want to say that they are all, in a way, they all have incredible importance. There are more groups working on these problems, especially in relationship to the brain and its negotiations, if you like, with the built. Well, not with the built, but rather simply with the concrete exterior world. There are more, but the latter are enough to invoke the array of different approaches and responses to the wide and sometimes wildly emerging field, and sufficient to convincingly affirm that there is nothing close to a consensus on what is to be known, let alone what questions are even proper or interesting to ask. Though I would say that that last little phrase is worth fighting about. Without the neuroscientists, there would be no such research at all. And their engagement, and now their, frankly, unlikely participation, is a rare moment for the design disciplines and sciences. As theorists, however, our responsibility, there's a few of us in the room, I engage you as I say this, is not just to understand and integrate the incredible new findings and formulations, but to provide directions for thought and the concepts that will help shape the collaboration. My own allegiances, and I declare these at the outset because I didn't really know where and how far I was actually going to get, are to the work of the late Gerald Edelman, to the cognitive neurobiologist Bruce Wexler at Yale, and to the neurohistorian Daniel Smale at Harvard. In addition, I hold that the synthetic formulations of earlier systematic neurobiologists, we don't really have that many systematic neurobiologists these days, that formed what many today think of as the prehistory of the field. People like Sherrington, von Iexkuel, and Kurt Goldstein, to be of critical importance as a corrective to much current speculation on widely distributed findings. I mean, the field of neuroscience clearly is producing so many new results, let's just leave it at that, and so many new ideas that in many ways it has shifted focus radically away from thinking through the big picture and formulating philosophically what the actual problems are. In sum, I'm arguing that it's the concepts of neurobiology which remain the best, and with few exceptions, the only viable resources we have for inventing relationships with our material and historical world. And I say that now from the point of view of, let's say, architect, designer, or theorist in our particular field. This name dropping has the hope and purpose of encouraging skepticism with respect to the focused approaches and agendas that are becoming increasingly refined and publicized today, as if they were explanations of something real. One typical example and I mean this with no aggressivity here, Michael, is the media phenomenon of mirror neurons. Another, the charismatic experimental triumphs beginning in the 1960s around the visual system and the architectures of visual signal processing. And I refer here, of course, to the incredibly publicized, well-known experiments that broke the field open in many ways of Hubel and Wiesel when they sewed the little cat's eyes shut and discovered the critical periods in brain development, et cetera, et cetera. Even these two examples are not at all equivalent, for the mirror neuron phenomenon, if real, has to date explained rather little. And what I will say here, though I want to make it very clear, is that I believe that Michael's work actually has been very important in limiting the, in many ways, the unbridled claims that were originally made for the importance and significance of that initial discovery in an Italian lab of the so-called mirror neuron. Researchers understandably cannot always keep in the foreground of their minds that brains are the outcomes of a historical relationship to a prodigious set of evolving challenges from the ambient material world, and as such represent exquisite products of design processes themselves. Hence, for those concerned with problems of design, the brain itself is first and foremost a device produced by and in the natural, and then later, as an added layer, social world. If its role is to do more acutely than what any other kind of matter or organization has been able to do, in other words, to perceive the world of which it is an inseparable and indivisible part itself, and to provide a platform from which to respond to and transform this world in turn, this only intensifies its status as a problem of design. This is one way in which the perennial dominance of vision and vision studies prejudices from the outset how we think about the brain-world interface. It may sound a little bit complicated the way I kind of unfolded that, but there's no doubt that I hope this doesn't come across wrong, the sort of money shot in neuroscience has to do with all the stuff going on around the study of the visual system. And I refer, for example, also to the work of Margaret Livingstone at Harvard, who's famously, and I think rather satisfyingly, solved the problem of the Mona Lisa's smile, among other things, simply through, if you like, a kind of an adumbration of the mechanics, the integrated mechanics of visual processing. The brain's greatest perceptual accomplishment, I would argue, is less how it intuits and receives information from the world on an ongoing basis in real time, but the way in which it incorporates and bridges to its environment in a far deeper, more fundamental, and more structural way. The following summary, or the summary notes, really, would be a brief or incomplete roster of some of the areas of design philosophy that implicitly or explicitly address this specific issue, yet which might not be routinely part of the menu of a contemporary science-based, research-based project seeking to understand more about architecture. Now, I guess I never really got around to properly making the argument in the notes that I wrote last night, and to be perfectly honest, extremely early this morning, where I really still felt I could close this thing and finish it up. But there are a couple of imbalances that we can note. I'm going to say this only in passing. These are things which I just put on the table, as they need to be for all the other research or think about it. Number one is the fact that it is theory that must guide, if you like, the integrated inquiry about design and neuroscience, that it is not the job of the scientists. We mustn't ask them or rely on them to do it. And to tell you the truth, 99% of the time they won't do it. It's not part of their training, or it's not part of the general habits of what they even consider to be proper or appropriate intellectual behavior. And secondly, there is a way in which their incredible openness these days to the problems that are being posed by, or the invitations that architects make to them. And I would say that there is, without a doubt, a prejudice that is installed right from the beginning when one begins to talk about something like the hand. I just want you to know, it's no criticism. What it really does, though, is I'm speaking much more to architects here and our own history. And that's to say is that these things are rooted very often in a kind of a fuzzy phenomenology, which had a historical moment in the 1950s and 60s, and from which, if you like, a lot of presuppositions continue to operate, and which in many ways our shift of interest to a variety of scientific disciplines in the last few years has actually helped, from our perspective, free us from. So I'm going to say that in some cases one can find that scientists are being used further, if you like, to, in some ways, memorialize and even preserve some of these older prejudices that have taken on the field. The first concept, I guess, that I'll present today goes back to the work of Kurt Goldstein, one of the great neurologists, actually, of the early, in fact, 20th century. From the late 1930s, my awareness of his goes back to around 1992, when we were preparing a translation of his great work, The Organism, for Zone. Goldstein's concept of pathology, the pathological, was key, I would argue, to a new conception of how the organism engages and participates in the world. Goldstein explained that the strange and extreme performances of altered or brain-damaged organisms were not symptoms of disease, but rather of the creative responses of transformed conditions that permit the organism to re-engage the world in full and uncompromised ways. In other words, a damaged organism will essentially remobilize to produce a full, if you like, kind of organismal existence in relationship to its world. In so doing, also transforming its world as it transforms itself. And what Goldstein talks about is that when behaviors start to become crazy, let's say, or extreme, or simply unprecedented, he says it is the great mistake of the medical, of the medical mind, or the presuppositions of the medical mind, to see these as symptoms of disease, when in fact they are expressions of a robust will, if you like, to life. These are creative performances. Symptoms do not belong to the disease, but to the impetus of life as it re-engineers a world and a posture for itself. And the posture is extremely important. Since everything that happens in the world, every change or event, constitutes a type of damage, and that's the word that Goldstein used, a kind of damage to an existing structure, an organism's task is to accommodate these changes on the fly by fashioning ever new relationships and, in effect, absorbing the ongoing damage continuously into itself. That's at the best of times and at the worst of times. The organism's nervous system, and I want to say that's not me saying so, that was one of Goldstein's really fundamental assertions. The organism's nervous system has as its primary task to adapt, to register and to move with the disturbances that characterize the transformations of the ambient world, as if through an invisible connective tissue or continuum. Its task is to endlessly generate new wholes from the remains of the previous order. Indeed, the very notion of order, and this is where the theorist perhaps would suddenly perk up his ears or her ears, is transformed now. The notion of order is transformed now from something stable, symmetrical, and in repose to something always out of step with itself, or always moving out of phase with itself, endlessly negotiating, projecting itself into the next moment, and incorporating change. Neurology, since the time of Sherrington, who is widely seen to be the father of modern neuroscience, has reconceived the world as a set of performances, and Sherrington's main treatise was called The Integrative Action of the Nervous System. What the nervous system does, in fact, is both integrate and to do so in a completely positive, if you like, active way, action. And it certainly fits with, for example, many of the emphases that A.Arbib made by associating motor behavior, if you like, with what we still continue to see as passive and receptive perceptual behavior. And I think he'd probably agree, if pushed, that the problem of perception needs to be understood as an active rather than a receptive process. So, neurology, since the time of Sherrington, has reconceived the world as a set of performances. They're known as stimuli, or were known as stimuli when originating in the exterior world, effectors or reflexes, the old language in some cases, when part of an organism, or behavior, or action, when organized by the organism in its entirety. The coordination of these performances is not only the full purpose of the organism, but it is a logical, even artistic response to the essentially dynamic and labile nature of physical reality. The nervous system in Goldstein is understood to have emerged as a dynamic and functional approximation of the fluidity of the external world itself. A dance of sorts where the dancers are indistinguishable from the dance. Sensing, sensitivity, sensateness are simply more complex niches in which information is exchanged between different or disparate parts of the environment, but that is only another way to say that information and energy are being circulated at a greater rate of volume or speed. Now, what I really want to, of course, emphasize here is that in this conception, the organism itself is integrally part of the world and the environment, and the transfer or the movement or the transformations, if you like, of energy, not energy, but rather in this case, let's say information, are really the same problem. If you like, it's a flat environment in which. Anyway, let's move on, because we have another important and maybe lost thinker in this history is Jakob Johann von Uexküll, who, of course, in a way has come back. His interest in his work has come back. Same years, the 1930s. Goldstein's work was published in German in 1939. Jakob Johann von Uexküll wrote two of his seminal works on animal ethology in these years, The Foray into the Worlds of Animals and Men, and the oddly titled Theory of Meaning. The principal concept in the works of this period was the idea of the Umwelt. Umwelt, the practical world or environment that corresponds to the sensory and biological endowment of any given organism. Von Uexküll rigorously distinguished between, on one side, what he called the world, and on the other, of the organism's environment. And that distinction between world and environment was very, very key in order to insist on the predominance of the fit between organism and its specific, let's say, personal world, as the determinant factor in generating a seamless operational circuit within which an organism lives its daily life. That's what the Umwelt was. In fact, an Umwelt and an organism were functionally inseparable. And he described this in terms of function circles, etc., Funktionskreise, etc. It was a remarkable, almost thermodynamic, or an early thermodynamic conception, if you like, of transformation and exchange, and which the very capacity of sensing and transferring, if you like, information and moving it was central. Only the figures, features, and functions in the world that represent assets for a particular organism, a small fraction of what is actually out there, and which would belong, let's say, to a world, which in fact, for which, or to which, the organism was necessarily indifferent, and which was indifferent to it, make up its Umwelt. So it's only the world of potential assets. But it is the nervous system and its specific modalities and ranges of perception that define both the animal and the sensible universe it inhabits. In sum, an animal constitutes a segment of a communicative circuit that simply connects and triggers in one part of the environment to responsive actions in another part, a more complex and layered part of the environment itself. The organism is really a compressed modulus, if you like, of communicational relationships and sensing capacities. But then again, when he famously reduces the tick to three simple capacities, to three simple affects, he's not wrong. The tick is blind, but its skin, for example. Anyway, I shouldn't go into it. This is a beautiful story you can all read on your own. Here again, we find what I call the immanentism that characterizes much of the theoretical biology of the era and which supplies the essential epistemological foundation for what would soon come to be called ecological thinking. So really what I'm talking about here is the missing component in so much, but not all, neuroscience, which is the neuroecology. And as I explained in a couple of emails, I was sort of thinking I would today maybe read this book by Leslie Valiant from Harvard's computation department, because he's developed an idea, which I frankly in the end found not very well developed, called ecorhythms. And of course, it's not rhythm as in, but it's ecorhythm as in algorithm, in which he begins to try to produce a comprehensive computational theory, if you like, of how sensing actually works, how the environment actually produces formally, if you like, the organism. Neurology, particularly with respect to its strongly materialist roots, represents a powerful fulcrum for model building, frequently overlooked in today's neuroscience speculations. The significant idea here is that organisms possess varying capacities to sense, and each modality of sensing activates and taps unique aspects and unfoldings of their environments, such that organisms do not exist in their environments, but are their environments themselves. And that's really the theme I'm going to try and develop today as we go on, maybe if I have time, on Goldstein. They have, in fact, over eons of evolutionary adaptation, tuned themselves to their surround, embedded themselves as active components into the material patterns and rhythms of their specific action universes. That is another area of particular interest to me, which is really paleo neurobiology, which really has to do with how the hell encephalization even happened, for example, in humans. What were some of the driving factors, and in fact, what did it change? And it's that kind of a cultural study, if you like, which is something that you find, neuroscientists don't really often like to think about that, though there are some really incredible examples of those who did, like, what's his name, McCleary, is it? McLean, whose triune brain theory remains today, to my shock and surprise, remains today something that continues to be discussed. Anyway, lest these descriptions be dismissed as archaisms from neurobiology's pre-empirical days, consider the work of Gerald Edelman, specifically his ideas of neural selectionism. I know I'm dropping a lot of terms here that I'm not going to be able to fully explain, but I think my basic goal here is to say this is a huge field, and there's a lot to mine here, to begin to invent, not just explain. His ideas of neural selectionism, re-entrant signaling, and what is often known as the binding problem. Edelman, formerly an immunological biologist, developed a model of how organisms interface with their environments, not only with respect to internalizing pathogens that produce alterations and disturbances known as disease, but also how the same organisms are able to sample their environments and transform themselves by developing immune responses that correspond to and resist such specific pathogenic forms. So there's a strange kind of communication going on here, and it needed to be explained. Edelman makes no secret of his interest in evolutionary theory, Darwinian evolutionary theory, more or less, as a way of, as a form of explanation, and has been almost solely responsible for extending the habits of mind associated with it into contemporary neurobiological theory, a subject which has largely been seen as incidental by other neurobiologists, but it isn't. I would say it's absolutely central. Indeed, one could argue that the single determining concept that has driven his work has been the notion of population thinking. That's a phrase of Ernst Mayer's. Ernst Mayr, the evolutionary biologist who coined the term, opposes this type of thinking to typological thinking, which he shows to be a fallacy hindering broader understanding of how natural forms and habitats are designed. So we've got to focus a bit on population thinking. Edelman proposed a model for how a state of the physical world, disease or pathogen, could engender a correlative, responsive, but not passive state in an organism. In other words, an antibody or immune reaction with such astounding and specific accuracy and speed. How the hell does the body know to customize, if you like, a molecular response, perfectly targeting and tailored, if you like, to the pathogen, which it could have come from Mars, and many people believe in some cases that they did. And I don't mean that as crazy, but it's simply one of the current possible theories of some type of protobiological structures. He opposed, such as viruses, etc. He opposed the instructionist model in which a foreign molecule would transmit information about its shape to an antibody molecule inside the body so that a protein could be customized to engage and fit around and hence neutralize its architecture. Edelman's Nobel Prize-winning work on the architecture of the immune response proved this theory wrong. That's what he got the Nobel Prize for, and proposed and proved the alternate theory of what he called the selectionist model. There is, and I quote him, no explicit, and what he means by explicit is material, information transferred between the environment and organisms that causes the population, in this case the population of immune cells, to change and increase its fitness. Evolution works by selection, not by instruction. I would posit that not only do we still operate in so much of our thinking in science as well as in philosophy and even in design according to the typological model and have not yet fully incorporated the population thinking model, but also that we are still constantly, reflexively returning to what one might call the instructionist model rather than the selectionist one. As it turns out, the body produces a vast and varied population of uniquely targeted antibody structures that simply activate and reproduce when challenged by a corresponding structure from the pathogen world. Now, this sounds a little bit recondite, but what I'm going to show is that Edelman took this exact model and transposed it to the brain, and in fact became, in many ways, the dominant sort of figure, if you like, in much of neuroscience in the last 35 years or 40 years. This is analogous to the way evolution works on the reservoir of genetic variation that lies under the surface in any population of apparently identical members of a species. Indeed, species, as Meyer argued, are not types, but infinitely varied populations. The population idea situates the engine of design in a deeply open-ended negotiation with changing conditions in the environment and shows it to have been itself designed specifically to engage and incorporate novelty from the world around it. Now that's where I would place the basic idea, the basic emphasis is that so much of the action of the advanced sort of mammalian nervous system in a way is meant not only just to respond to and passively, but actually to incorporate, to engage, to collaborate, if you like, with novelty. In fact, to turn it into, to channel it, if you like, into structures, let's say, and experiences that have no precedent, that were not foreseeable, and that, in fact, are entirely new. But I would like to say that from the moment you do that, you're dealing with a new circuitry of challenge, damage, and necessary invention, which is the foundation of the nervous system. Employing the same model, Edelman set about to provide an explanatory mechanism of the brain. Edelman's model of the brain is complicated and extremely rich, and by way of example, I'll focus on just one rudimentary step in a highly entailed system. Are we at 30 minutes? Okay. I'll finish this little section and we'll let it go. This is the secondary repertoire. Brain cells and connections, as many know, are generated in the human's early life at a staggering rate. As many as 100,000 new connections per second are sprouted during the first 6 months of development after the infant is out of the womb and exposed to the random happenstances and assaults of the world around it. And I will just mention very quickly that the human is the only animal who spends such a huge portion of the period in which its brain is developing in interaction with and in the world rather than in the womb. And this has produced a radical difference, if you like, between humans and all other organisms. I hope I'll get around to explaining that, but maybe not. I'll do it later. But not all 100,000 connections can or are preserved, and only those that get used persist, those that don't wither and are pruned. How a connection comes to be used is what concerns us here. The texture of the world, its features and events, trigger responses in the spontaneous internal talk between cells, automatically and involuntarily, like a recorder that cannot be turned off. I would make that even stronger, since I'm not going to get around to dealing with Wechsler's ideas, who actually develops these ideas more powerfully than Edelman, is that the brain absolutely depends and requires on almost violent, if you like, and ceaseless input from the external world in order for it even to build itself. You can't actually even have a material brain without this endless stimulus, at least during certain periods of development. The human brain begins like a cannon emitting buckshot into a continent, dredging and sampling the external world for features and memorializing each one in its built form, more or less enduringly, if not permanently, setting itself to its specific place and portion of existence, just as plants in a vineyard incorporate and express the subtle specificities of their regional origins and terroir. Give me 1 second here to figure out where I can end. I'm going to ask for your apology. I'm going to apologize and ask for your, I'm going to just go to the very end where there were some, I hope, some semi-provocative conclusions. What we design is directly connected to what capacities we have within us for transformation and change, and all the evidence suggests that this is whoa. That was a bad wager. Okay. We must, I think this will work, we must resist the default scenarios of our contemporary economic and intellectual environment that conceives of the human fate in relation to its ambient world as one of artificially increasing its fit or optimizing its operations as if proceeding through the protocols of applied engineering. Now, that's what we cannot do, and that is not the proper use of neuroscience in engineering. It's not about setting into motion a whole new program of, frankly, human and social engineering. We must not think about the neuroarchitecture problem as one of modifying the environment to better tap or harvest the competences in the human substrate, a clearly predatory nightmare scenario, but rather must understand the fundamental asset implied by neural plasticity, and I guess this is the first time I ever actually mentioned that in this talk, neural plasticity, which is its psychotropic capacities, its capacities to actually transform experience and perception, to change our moods, to change our body states and our mental states, the endless possibilities of changing our states of body and mind, which are not simply to maximize our productivity, but rather to maximize the richness of our experience of the world and of our annexation of the world. Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to have a little discussion. If all the scholars could please go to the table. And Professor Beasley, you're going to join us. Dux had to unfortunately leave to do a conference call for an application he's working on. But we're very happy to have Philip Beasley joining us. Okay, so I'm going to have to maybe throw a few different questions after that. Let's see if I'm capable of doing that. But I just wanted to start with a couple questions. Maybe we'll start first with Michael, and again try to see if we can, as architects and designers, and I appreciate that, Sanford, shine the light back on what we do here in the School of Architecture, relative to architectural education. So some of these discussions, I think you guys can respond to these any way you'd like, but I think that they, at least maybe will get us talking about this a little bit. Let's start with this one first. Maybe this would be interesting because it has to do with mirroring systems. I don't know if Professor Mulgrave is here yet, but let's start with this. And some of these are just ways that I'm trying to work through this, having a huge familiarity with neuroscience and trying to educate myself in the last several weeks and see how there's a kind of productive tension between the two. So let's start with this one first. Mirroring systems in humans, also described as embodied simulation, is where similar neural activity is stimulated both while performing a manual activity and observing one. Harry Mulgrave in The Arctic's Brain argues, quote, models of embodied simulation posit that the same neural structures involved in our own body-related experiences contribute to the conceptualization of what we observe in the world around us. He links this concept with Robert Vischer as a feeling into, or the empathetic relationship that we maintain with the world through which the self projects or merges with a phenomenal object in an aesthetic simulation. Emphatic responses have been shown not only socially, but intercellularly between animate and inanimate objects. Does the concept of empathy as it relates to physical material behavior and material transformation affect cognition differently through hands-on experimentation, let's say, versus digital simulation? And does this suggest the need for radical materiality as part of the formative pedagogy of an architectural curriculum? Now you guys can answer all these. And finally, how does this relate to the concept of the haptic? Someone like to start there?
Yeah, I think the haptic is Michael's.
Well, we have heard about senses in relation to actions. So obviously, if you get serious about the hand, for a lot of the time, the haptic, the sense of touch, predominates over the sense of vision, and they're inextricably coupled during behavior. So this just links into the idea that we are engaged in multiple senses. But the other point that's raised with the notion of empathy is that here we enter the world of emotion and our ability to sense the emotions of others. And one neuroscience finding is that people who are better at recognizing the actions of others, irrespective of emotional state, are also more empathetic. So in other words, you are registering aspects of the behavior of others that are not necessarily emotional. This may endow you better to see and respond to their emotions. So the mystery is why that should be relevant to architecture. And the response, I suppose, would be that by abstracting away from or building upon those things which can evoke emotional and other states in people, a building can have a sense of majesty or a sense of intimacy and things of that kind. In other words, a locus for behaviors of a certain kind, and in that sense can create empathy in a way that taps our human forms of empathy and yet becomes of a different degree.
Phil, can you talk about this a little bit too? Because I'm curious relative to some of your work too, and the kind of, this might relate to kind of the kind of feedback, the kind of, let's say a kind of between, or Sanford, you're talking about this as well, that there's this kind of deep intermingling between the environment and the subject, right? The potential new forms of subjectivity between these, and whether empathy is related to this or not, it's just a hunch, but can you talk about that at all? Because your work really addresses some of that, I think.
Sure, I can, and folks that don't know me, I'm quite involved in making dissipative and diffusive environments that are quite interconnected. The question of the haptic in this panel, I heard an extraordinary series of optimisms in these presentations. the mechanical construction of empathy. It was just the most delicious experience to be able to see the mapping within brain models that Michael offered us, and to see that far from simply a constructed sentiment of hope, a kind of an illusion, we could see very tangibly the operations of empathy, of identification, of finding resonance, of feeling with, operating in the brain. And then the translating immediately into the physical realm with the extraordinary tracings in paper of creating latencies, of not simply projecting from Platonic first principles, but rather intensely playful cycles of creating possibility fields that then the paper would fold itself into and be received by in order to realize its forms. I thought that Dukes' presentation was very provocative as a prototypical conception of architecture as having embedded resonances in it,
Yes.
receiving and playing. And then Sanford's immensely provocative counter or follow-up in which I heard him turn around the prospect of disease, and instead of thinking of that as something which we need to be fortified against or be terrorized by, I heard a really quite moving optimism about it being an operation of negotiation and adaptation and form making, and the reality of multiple forms of viabilities which fall far outside a sense of safety, let's say. But then if it's possible to have a sense of fertility and projection and a willingness to experience that continuum, I found that to be an incredibly moving invitation to think of architecture as being much more a kind of soil that would be pervasive, rather than, let's say, a house or a stripped stage on which we would act in safety. And so that suggests to me that the architecture could be conceived as a kind of place of pluripotency, of latency, of fertility, and the operation of an architect then could be one of designing resonances. Now that does not necessarily imply a complete, absolute Catholic plurality which is undifferentiated, because that would have a problem as well. That would result in just pure saturation, which would result in a kind of leveling. There's a risk if you say yes, 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 to become starved of oxygen and to become flat. But if there are cycles of mortality included in this, of cutting and of convulsion, as well as extending in this kind of embodied, physical, playful continuity, then it seems like we have the possibility emerging of a model for architecture as a kind of fertile soil. So I find it just an immensely provocative set of ingredients for a model of architectural practice that we've just been given.
First of all, I want to comment on the question. I would like to thank you because Philip sort of answered a question that I didn't answer yesterday. When asked to give our fellow panelists some idea, well, we were all asked to give some idea of what it is we were going to talk about. I just sent a short letter, principally to Michael, basically saying that unless we gave up this very restricted, conventional idea of architecture, we weren't really going to make any progress in terms of formulating the proper questions with respects to how neuroscience can actually be deployed to creatively. And he wrote back, says, well, what did you mean by that? Because, of course, the thing, typically one feels that the object that needs to be explained is architecture. And what Philip has basically done is answer the question. It's not at all true. It's not a building that needs to be explained. It's a much more fundamental set of relationships. The next thing, which would really have to do with how we negotiate space and time and matter. There is a theory that's been kicking around with and having a great deal of influence in the paleoanthropology world of the last 15 years, and it is known as the social brain hypothesis. And its arguments are mostly rooted in understanding, if you like, how the specific competences that evolved in the hardware of the human brain may well have been driven and, in fact, may have well been responses, if you like, to certain pressures and as a way of managing, in the first order, social relationships, but in the second order, managing the entire ecological environment simply by the social brain hypothesis. Among the famous hypotheses of the social brain hypothesis is that the brain is capable of managing all of the potential interactions that could take place between up to a maximum of 150 other social actors, which is why hunter-gatherer populations are supposedly more or less limited to populations within that range. Kinship structures, cheats, the whole social thing, maintained by gossip, by the way, which is now increasingly being seen to be, well, you know, the social brain hypothesis in some channels basically argues that encephalization, the huge, especially the prefrontal cortex, really develops to manage gossip, and that gossip is what manages human populations, and human populations are what partition the resources in the landscape, and on and on and on. The bottom line here is, if such a thing is true, we probably need to open our own thinking up and realize that the social actors that are being managed, let's say, and processed by the social brain are not solely and uniquely human ones. They are anything that behaves and that moves and that changes. And the social nature of the brain may very well be another way of saying that it is a device essentially for tracking transformation, change, and time. And that, in fact, that's what an organism is. It is a strange type of which a human is only a very advanced form. It's a strange type of structure that maintains itself with certain constancies, but also tolerates a certain amount of, let's say, variability within different parameters of constancy. So it's the management of parameters, maybe what the brain is all about, which is why, in fact, we have to realize that another organism may well be that, a modulus of shifting parameters, and that's what makes, if you like, you know, that's what the foundations, perhaps, of all interaction in psychology are. But that changes, if you like, in many ways, the way in which we would continue to speculate about the so-called empirical findings of neuroscience. I wonder what Michael thinks about that.
Michael, do you want to respond?
Well, yeah. I just have to put on record that Gerald Edelman is not considered as a leading neuroscientist of the last 30 years, but rather considered as a gifted expositor, some of whose ideas are original and many of which are recycled. Having got that off my chest, let me and I have a nice story, but that's over drinks, not
Fair enough.
on the podium. Anyway, I like this provocative statement. Let's consider the social actors as not being just humans, but almost anything that moves and changes. And I think we need to carry this a little bit further, because another pressure for evolution, as we look at many different animals, is this classification of things which move, in many cases, into predators and prey. And these are to be considered separately from those who may be assimilated to one's views of agents, and maybe not. Let me get back to that in a moment. So we see strategies for avoiding predators, strategies for capturing prey as crucial matters of shaping the brain and the body, as well as the social relationships. And so another aspect complementing the gossip theory is that, in fact, it was the challenges of first scavenging and then hunting very large animals that allowed, that encouraged, as it were, the evolution of both neural and social strategies. So that's the first point I wanted to make. The second point is that this issue of when do we regard another creature or a tree as being in some sense a person is very important. So we have this whole notion of animism, which in some cases may be, what do you do to propitiate the deer before you kill it? So that we see this business of projecting, as it were, our human social relations onto the other as creating important structures, but also perhaps as laying the basis for religion. And then we can see something like monotheism as a highly symbolized version, and depending on your taste, this either finds the underlying reality or throws the complex reality away. And then one more aspect to complement the notion of gossip as a key factor in the emergence of language as distinct from human complexity generally is the notion of storytelling. So the way in which memory of the tribe, memory of the culture becomes enshrined. And so perhaps this is another way of managing the growing complexity of groups at the same time as providing a pressure for the evolution of linguistic ability.
I wonder if I could follow on both of your comments by asking both of you a question. Simply, I mean, in your terms, Michael, the operation of the mirror neurons, is there any sense in which that operation creates overhead, that it's a luxury, that it taxes an organism? What are the consequences of taking on empathy in this way? You know, I guess I'm asking because in the back of my mind, I have been taught by my culture to care, but also to watch out, and to not, and the sense that opening your boundaries is actually a very dangerous thing. And perhaps following that, Sanford, if you're indulging me in my projecting optimism into your description of this enormously involved kind of expanded model of an organism, can you speak explicitly about death?
Okay, so while you think about a profound answer to that challenge, let me just say, as Sanford alluded to in his remarks, a problem with mirror neurons is they have captured the public imagination in an unfettered way. And so many people write articles where they just take the sort of the intuition of mirror neurons and then talk as if there's science to support their wild claims. So one has to be very careful about, I used one example as a cautionary note, the example of the human brain reacting to the dog barking, to make the point that our reaction to actions of others need not involve the mirror neurons. There are brain systems that can make use of that. But turning to the specific question of Philip, the issue there is that mirror neurons come in certain flavors. There are some that are involved in carrying out and recognizing actions. There are others that are more involved in carrying out and recognizing emotional states, and these neurons may occur in different parts of the brain. But secondly, if you will, the whole point about the proper use of mirror neurons is that they may enrich your understanding of what others are doing, but you're in bad trouble if you automatically repeat what they're doing, which is sort of the crude notion of you see it, therefore you do it. We all have perhaps one friend who has this strange echolalia that as you speak, they're repeating your words as they go along, and you think, this is a strange person, isn't it? And so the brain evolves multiple systems which provide capabilities that can be used at a basic level, but that can be inhibited. So in certain social groupings, being able to, in some sense, incorporate the emotional state of the other is conducive. In other cases, having brain systems that can inhibit that. A scientific colleague with whom I feel uncomfortable, if he smiles at me, my mirror neurons are immediately suppressed. Why is he smiling at me? You know, is he smiling with me or is he smiling at me? So the brain has evolved to exploit mirror neurons in some circumstances, put them in their place at others. But just to lead into Sanford's remarks, it doesn't oblige us to be dead when we see someone else who is dead. So mirroring has its limits. That was meant to be a joke, by the way.
The smile is a very complicated thing, isn't it? Well, first of all, it's great that the concept of animism did come up.
I have a question about that too.
And I believe that no contemporary discussion of empathy can actually leave the complicated problem of animism. The reason it's complicated is because on one level it's associated with a pre-modern mindset. On another, it is also associated with the very origins, in many ways, of biological thought. And I refer here to 18th and 19th century Romanticism and the general feeling, I don't know exactly what the right words are here, but the general feeling of a kind of sympathy with nature, with natural processes, if you like, which did originally give rise to what became systematic scientific biology. There is I feel like there's one, the whole question of death, I didn't think about it while I was listening to Michael. I was thinking much more about how complicated the problem is, if you like, in that the mirror neuron is actually an enhancement, is an enhancement, let's say, of other processes of perception that are going on, or not, if in fact they are excluded from being bound, let's say, or processed with what's going on. But it was this, is that there is someone who's not specifically a neurobiologist or a neuroscientist, but whose work dominated cognitive psychology for 50 years, and that is J.J. Gibson. And this was something that I began to think about when I was reading some of Michael's work, where he refers to schemas. I'm not sure where Michael gets the concept of schema, but he may not be a big fan of Edelman, but Edelman's idea of maps and neuronal groups and how the hypothesis of how it is that they might function serves a rather different purpose than the concept of schema. But one of the issues around the concept of schema is the implication that there is something that is experienced and then stored and retained and later recalled in order to process subsequent experience. Now, in the late work of J.J. Gibson, particularly in his book called The Ecological Approach to Visual Perception, among the really radical hypotheses that he presents and upon which he founds all of his late work is the concept that there is, in fact, in perception, there is, and I quote, there is no storage. No engrams, no schemas, no residual material is stored and compared to any subsequent perception. That what actually happens is the organism or the perceiver simply becomes increasingly skilled at processing the data as it comes. I'm just wondering, because one of the experiences I had teaching at Harvard and sometimes dealing with some of this stuff was having students migrate from the architecture school and to begin to do some work. I have no idea why people like Margaret Livingstone had time for these people, but in the neurosciences department, one thing you found is that there was a general awareness of Gibson's work, but only his early work, and definitely not the work that constitutes what he called his ecological, well, the great disavowal that came when he discovered that perception was something that happened only in motion, only in moving in relationship to the environment. So it is that idea that there is no storage, which I find one of the most complicated and mysterious formulations, and I'm just wondering whether or not this stuff ever makes its way into the circles that you
Does that, can you, I mean, I know there's lots of questions, maybe this is the last thing, but Michael, I had a question similar to that too, but it's related to, relative to schema instances too, but I know Sam was talking about kind of this idea of storage, but you had a whole concept of cooperative computation, right? Is that, can you talk about that a little bit relative to what's...
Well, unfortunately, there'll be no lunch because we... Okay, so let me just, first, J.J. Gibson, you may recall that one of my frames was distinguishing how, the sort of, what is it about the object in the world, in this case, that provides the opportunity, the affordance for the hand to shape itself. And that, for me, is a Gibsonian concept. A favorite example of mine of Gibson's is optic flow, that if you're walking down a busy street, then you don't have to consciously think there is somebody, they're 6 feet away, they're moving. You just take a step to the side and keep going. That your peripheral vision can feed your brain to compute time until contact and avoid it. But I continue with a joke that I think is anti the later Gibson. I get a call later from a friend who said, "Why were you avoiding me?" Because when this Gibsonian mechanism allowed me to avoid collision and not engage my facial recognition schemas, I didn't register who this person was. So for me, it's a matter of how do you combine. It's not that the brain is a serial computer. I used to say, just because the brain looks like a bowl of porridge or oatmeal, it doesn't mean it's a serial computer. So it's not that the brain can do only one algorithm and follow it. Rather, multiple things are happening in the brain. I mean, here I'm totally in agreement with Edelman. And so in particular, normally you're integrating in that scene scenario, you're integrating those schemas, those storages of memory and prior experience that let you know that somebody is a friend, somebody is an enemy, somebody you haven't met, with those other processes that don't invoke that. But still are based, after all, skill is a form of memory, but it's a matter of which memories can be brought into the declarative stage and which memories inform your skill without your knowing about it. So I consider myself a computational neo-Gibsonian, as well as a computational neo-Piagetian, to give my skill roots. But there is a synthesis then of different historical elements in something that does try to look at the competition and cooperation of multiple processes in the brain as we carry out any negotiation with the world or with other people.
Catherine?
Is this on?
It is, yep.
I just want to, I'm anxious to jump in, but there's a lot on the table. And I won't be able to say this as eloquently as all the speakers have said it, but I think it is true that the sort of theorization of the subject matter is confronting what it's always confronted, and that is in a scientific discourse, particularly contemporary or modern science, that it's the sort of speculative modality while operating in any kind of scientific enterprise up front to get funding and so forth is held in check for reasons of evidence and repeatability of the experiment and so forth. So those scientific parameters also insist upon a certain interpretation of the mirror neuron phenomenon, and even the name itself is involved in that. And because I'm not deeply familiar with that phenomenon, but it seems to me that the drive to discover correlatives between the brain matter and the what's happening to the body, or what's happening around the body or in relation to the body, is very, very strong, and that it could easily lead one into, and obviously I'm sure you're controlling for this to some degree in experimental work, but that it could easily lead to a sort of over-reading or under-reading of what is taking place. And particularly if you're ruling out the inherent instability of the players, so to speak, the hand and the eye and the individual and the person and the object and so on. So that all of which can take many forms under many circumstances and are not even to a certain degree identifiable what sort of modality they're acting in or without, out of. And I don't know if you'd agree with that terminology, but I'm really interested in, I was thinking while you were talking about this, whether you had also read, for example, Leroy-Gourand, who has done the amazing, he was a paleontologist, just to add to Sanford's very sort of erudite list of predecessors. And it's flawed because it has elements of teleology and purposefulness, but the interesting thing is that he doesn't place the evolutionary emphasis on the brain. He places it on the hand, really, the liberation of the hand from the ground and so forth, and the liberation of the head and the mouth from nutritional provision, and that interaction, which is the goad to the development of the sort of the more sophisticated brain. And so what I want to know is where, you could say the hand is obviously proprioceptively involved with the brain. I don't even know if that word is relevant anymore, but that the hand has, that gestural talent in a certain sense before the brain has, a language center or whatever. So, or maybe they arise at the same time. But it seemed to me that there was more to say about that it wasn't obvious that the hand that the motion of the hand toward the object and taking the shape of the object in some sense would be dimensionalized by the activity of the neuron, that the neuron might be excited because it has to work, or it would feel muscular stimulus or whatever, or nervous system, whatever. Of course, it would come alive in some form, but to actually suggest that it has a directional kind of sending of instructions, I think, is, or that there's a task, anyway. So I just feel, seemed to me that the oscillatory potential for the hand, the eye, the mouth, the brain, the faciality, and other postural positioning of the body and so forth, all of those things enter in and are, and not be, yeah. So that that oscillatory character, is what I'm saying, is gets ruled out in favor of a much more satisfying, from a particular point of view, belief that if we can see in our brains what we're doing in the world, which is highly reductive.
I want to throw something in because there is René Thom was a great mathematician in the late 20th century, Fields Medal, etc. And his main book was called Structural Stability and Morphogenesis, in which there was an extraordinary section on what he called the capture morphology, where he precisely was trying to mathematize and formalize what constituted an organism, in a certain sense, capturing and subduing and then incorporating another. And he used the whole discussion because he was trying to explain language as a form of capturing of the world. And he used the word prehendere as a way of connecting the actual action of the hand grasping an object and the brain intuiting something about the relationships in the world which were structured formally, let's say, or came to be structured formally in language. And he basically tried to formalize them with a single geometrical diagram to show that they were exactly the same phenomenon.
Okay.
I'll give you the page. It's crazy, but it's...
No, that's all right. So firstly, to summarize my response to your work, there's no claim that the brain evolved without the body evolving. So I use the term expanding spiral, which might relate to your oscillations and rhythms. So if the hand has a certain capability, then the brain can evolve in a way that would not have been adaptive otherwise. But when that more sophisticated brain is available, then changes in the hand can be useful. So we all get the idea that something like an upright stance had to precede increased use of the hands, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there was no claim that it was the brain all by itself. It's just one way of tapping into that cycle, that spiral of coevolution of brain and body, and of course we were emphasizing social structure as well. In response to Sanford, one anecdote. I was many years ago at a conference at which René Thom was one of the speakers, and he was presenting his theory of language, and the linguists began to explain all the phenomena that he could not explain in his theory. And at that stage he thumped the table and said, "It is a theory, it is not a method." So
that was his drama for 50 years.
Yeah, but briefly, he did fundamental work on structural stability. A man named Zeeman was able to take some of his work on what was called catastrophe theory and show that these could be used to explain a number of physical... No, I think Zeeman did some real stuff. And, okay, drinks later. But his use of the word prehendery, I mean, that's totally standard English, right? We talk about comprehension, so prehension. I am apprehensive that you will give me a rough time, and so on. The prehension is dominant.
We have to, okay. Well, there'll be plenty more stimulating conversations for the rest of the next 2 days. Thank you very much. Time for lunch.